Hi, and welcome to Check Your Thread, a podcast about sewing more sustainably. My name's Zoe, and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 13 years and am the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me on this journey. Hello, lovely listeners. How is it going? Well, I hope. I'm doing well. My kids went back to school this week, so I've been piecing my work routine back together. I also recorded a conversation for the podcast for the first time in yonks. I'm going to share a bit about that on the Patreon, but everyone will hear it in podcast episode form in due course. I want to tell you about an episode of someone else's podcast that might interest you. A listener named Laura emailed me and kindly let me know about an episode of a podcast called Fiber Nation. That's fiber spelt the American way, F-I-B-E-R. And the episode is called Home Economics versus Hitler. It was mainly about the role of women and the importance of sewing in America immediately before, during and after the Second World War. Thanks so much for sharing it, Laura. It was such an interesting listen. Anyone who enjoyed the Make, Do and Mend mini-series of episodes that I made for Check Your Thread will love this episode of Fiber Nation. I'll put a link to it in the show notes that you can find on checkyourthread.com. Sewing-wise, I hope your projects have been going well. It's been rainstorms almost constantly here in the UK over the last week, so it's feeling pretty autumnal, but it's still pretty warm, so I've been reluctant to start on the few cold weather projects that I've got planned. Instead, this week I finished off my blouse and I've been making a pair of pyjama shorts for myself. So for the PJ shorts, I took my findings from the Walk the Plank PJ pattern that I trialled for my most recent Free Pattern Friday blog post, and I applied what went well and what didn't to my self-drafted PJ pattern to make what I hope will be the perfect PJ shorts. I'm using some precious stash fabric, which is a length of Atelier Brunette printed cotton poplin, and it's got a cute sailboat design. And I've had that in my stash for about 7 years. Sustainability-wise, I'm recording this intro on Friday, and I'm hoping to take my daughter tomorrow to the Festival of Resistance in Hyde Park in London, which is being organised by Extinction Rebellion. I didn't know about this when I recorded last week's intro, otherwise I would have mentioned it. Unfortunately, when this goes out, it will have already have happened. Anyway, the blurb says it's meant to be an opportunity to explore creative solutions to the climate and social crises we face and learn about deliberative democracy and the power of citizens' assemblies. Apparently there will be inspiring speakers, great bands, arts, workshops, non-violent direct action trainings, poetry and panel discussions. My daughter's not been feeling very well today though, so I'm not sure if we'll be going. But if we do, I'll report back next week with anything I learnt or experienced at the event. This week, Whitney, Anna and Judy deserve massive thanks for signing up as the newest supporters of the podcast via Patreon. I really appreciate all the patrons who are keeping this endeavour afloat. If the podcast has made an impact on you, perhaps it's made you think about something differently, or it's inspired you in some way, and if you feel you could afford the equivalent of a cup of coffee each month, please find the link to sign up via the episode description or via the website checkyourthread.com. Okay, so let's get into today's episode. This is the first of a two-part mini-series about sewing and saving money, which we'll look at from two different angles over the 2 episodes. This one starts with an unapologetically political rant about the current cost of living crisis, which adds a lot of context. I'm not even ready to talk about the new Prime Minister and the horrendous cabinet that she's put together. Let's just crack on with this podcast. Interestingly, I've been working on both these episodes for ages, but the current situation gave it a different spin and a relevance that I just couldn't ignore. So we're exploring the question, can sewing save you money, by looking at mending, garment sewing, quilt making and making reusable products. I also share a listener question about opportunities to use sewing skills in a voluntary capacity to help those in need. If you can help the listener out with any info, or if there are any other ways that you can think of that sewing can save you money, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or via Instagram @checkyourthread. The show notes this week include a summary of the main points of this episode and links to anything linkable that I mentioned. Okay, enjoy! I've been planning a Can Sewing Save You Money episode for a while, and with the news currently filled with details of the cost of living crisis and an equal number of articles on what you can do to combat its effects, I decided to develop the episode quicker. In the UK, we are currently in the throes of what is being called a cost of living crisis, and all trustworthy predictions are saying that it's set to get worse before it gets better. There have always been people in the UK that live on or below the poverty line, and many, many years of government cuts to pretty much all forms of social support has really compounded that. But what's happening now is that there's been a dramatic rise in fuel, energy and food prices, combined with a lack of wage increase, an unstable employment market and increasingly expensive accommodation, all of which is going to get worse. And for the first time, everyone in society but the most wealthy are feeling the sting. But let's call the cost of living what it is. An accelerated move of capital upwards. That's how capitalism works generally, of course, but the speed and breadth of which is currently happening feels unprecedented in our lifetimes. So let's be crystal clear, it is never the people at the top who suffer. The CEOs and shareholders never lose out. They don't even put their bonuses on hold for a year or two. Currently, while millions and millions of people in this country are planning to delay or even completely avoid putting on the heating this winter, energy companies are reporting, because they have to report these things, record profits and divvying that out between the CEOs and the shareholders. I read an article in The Guardian last week that I'm going to link to in the show notes that talked about the latest annual report by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is an independent social change organisation with a goal of ending poverty. Their research has established what a basic, decent, no-frills lifestyle in the UK today looks like and how much that would cost. They then compared that to the income of various household situations. They worked out what a single person without kids working full-time or minimum wage would earn. And they worked out what a couple with 2 young kids with both adults working full-time or minimum wage would earn. The results showed that the single person would earn £7,000 less than they would require for a decent, no-frills lifestyle on an annual basis, and the family would make £6,200 less. They also looked into what life might look like for a single adult receiving Social Security and a single-parent family with 2 kids on Social Security. In those scenarios, the single person will receive just 32% of what they need for a decent life, and the single-parent family just 54% of what they would need. And what does that mean? For those on lower incomes, it means that many, many more people will soon be living close to or at the poverty line. And it means that average working people and families are going to be doing what they need to do to make ends meet, which always impacts other working people and small businesses the most. People look for subscriptions to cancel, they don't support local shops who have to charge more for equivalent products than the chains, they don't visit their local cafes and restaurants as much or at all, they don't get their hair cut so often, and they reduce donations to charities. If you're in the fortunate position to own your own home, it means not investing in home improvements and even delaying getting things repaired, and all the myriad other ways that people are forced to tighten the metaphorical purse strings. People are forced to become conservative with a small c because they can't afford to take chances and go out on a limb to support something new or worthy. Everyone ends up having to withdraw support and patronage from other workers and small businesses, which exacerbates the problem. Of course, the individuals and families who already live closer to the poverty line already know all about this only too well. And of course, they are the people that all this will affect the most. There have been countless interviews broadcast in the media in recent months talking to lower income people, saying that they are literally having to choose between feeding their families and putting the heat on. And it's important to remember that older people and people with disabilities, those for whom having the heating on is even more important for their health, statistically these people are already living on a lower average income than the rest of us. So for many of them, this news is even more terrifying. These financial concerns push the climate crisis and environmental issues further down the personal and political list of priorities. The vague hope knocking about is that with fewer people putting the heating on, there'll be a reduction in fossil fuel use. But I haven't heard of any subsequent big drive to invest in renewable energy generation, because it simply doesn't serve those who currently are in power and those who support them. There is also the hope that more people will turn to second-hand options for the things that they want and need, be that charity shops, Facebook Marketplace, eBay or Vinted or what have you. I'm hopeful that a big shift in that direction will occur, but I'm also sceptical. Instead, I fear that more people will go for cheap, poorly made products from the high street and Amazon and so on that won't last very long and end up in landfill before long. What I fear will not be reduced, at least in any significant way, is the purchasing of cheap, affordable clothing and fast fashion. With the increase in food costs, fewer people are going to pick the organic and free-range products, although organic food production does much to repair depleted soil and ecosystems and will guarantee food security in the long term. Plus, rising energy and fuel bills are already driving people to stock up on additional blankets, thermals and warm layers, particularly products made from fleece, which we all know is made from byproducts from fossil fuels. And I'm predicting brands pushing a massive amount of cheap heat-saving products and devices that are going to be marketed to capitalise on people's panic. I really hope that I'm wrong and I'm being overly pessimistic, but this situation is looking pretty grim from where I'm sitting at the moment. So now I've thoroughly depressed you, and if you haven't already stopped listening, let's bring in the topic of sewing. So as I mentioned at the top, I've actually been planning an episode on ways sewing might be used to save money for a while. I had been viewing the topic as an interesting updated extension of the Make, Do and Mend mini-series that I made. But for me, the topic recently took on a different angle and level of importance. By the way, this episode will have a sister episode on how to make sewing cheaper, which will be coming next week. So, the question I'm posing: can using our sewing skills save us money? Based largely on my personal opinion and some light research, my too long didn't read answer is possibly. But I must qualify this by noting that trying to do so might not be much fun. If we switch up our mindset and are able to embrace the challenge of sewing to save money, then we might be able to find things to make and ways of doing it that will save us money while still enjoying ourselves. But before we go any further, I have to clearly state that no one should feel a responsibility to use their time, skills, resources, hobby, method of relaxation or personal passion to attempt to shave some pounds off their monthly outgoings if they don't want to. As Shams Eldin Rogers noted in episode 49, sewing is a craft and art form that exists within the domestic sphere, and therefore those of us who sew are regularly put upon, or at least approached, to use what is ours for the benefit of others in a way that just doesn't happen with most other pastimes. So I want to make it clear that by making this episode, I am in no way suggesting it is any sewer's responsibility or obligation to try and use sewing to save your household some money. My intention is actually the opposite. My goal is to provide some ideas that might empower those who are feeling concerned right now and looking for inventive ways to improve their situation by using their skills. In short, I'm not saying you should try any of this. I'm just making some suggestions that might interest you. And whether or not any of this actually has any financial impact, making and doing stuff with your hands can make people feel more positive in stressful times. So that's also a benefit worthy of note. Right, so I've split my ideas up into a few categories and offered some comments on mindset, which might make them more fun. But one additional thing I'd like to add is that all these ideas for how you can save money by using your skills can also help reduce the impact of our lives on the environment. So that is awesome in and of itself. Right, so first up, mending. This is the one category that I can be absolutely sure can save you money. Mending clothing and other textile items, such as bags or household items, absolutely saves money. By keeping these items in use for longer, you are delaying the need to replace them, whether you would be replacing them by buying the equivalent item or buying the materials to make things that fulfill the same role. I just mended the holes in the knees of my husband's jeans, for example, and immediately they're back in rotation, which means we'll be delaying the need to drop 40 quid on a new pair for a few months at least. However, I know that for many sewers, garment sewers, quilters, accessory makers, and so on, mending isn't as much fun as starting a new project from scratch, or for some, any fun at all. I totally get it. But by focusing on the benefits of having that item back in use, or perhaps by researching a new-to-you mending technique or approach, hopefully you can find the motivation and it be a positive experience rather than a chore. Personally, to tackle my mending pile, I focus on the benefit of being the change that you want to see in the world. When I'm doing a visible mend in particular, I focus on how this garment will then go out into the world and help normalise mended clothing. Making clothing from scratch. As anyone who's into garment sewing knows, buying quality materials to sew a garment from scratch almost always costs more these days than buying the equivalent garment from the shops. And that is without factoring in the cost of your time and labour, depreciation of equipment, the power to run our machines and iron, and so on. Developments in mass manufacturing, resource extraction, processing and transportation, combined with the relocation of manufacturing industries and the deliberate exploitation of the workforce in the global south, has meant that mass-manufactured clothing and other goods are now much cheaper than the equivalent would have been 20 or 30 years ago. But is there a way to make sewing clothing cheaper than buying it? I'll be going into how to cut the costs of sewing more directly in next week's episode. However, I do think that if you use resources you already own, in particular your fabric stash, as well as sewing patterns in your possession, or if you use free patterns or tutorials, and you don't factor in your time into the equation, you can just about save money on clothing. This is probably only true, however, if the shop-bought equivalent item isn't at fast fashion prices, and the garment that you make instead is well thought out and fits your body, personal style and lifestyle so well it's going to see a long life with lots of use. What we should also factor into this though is the speed of acquisition. According to Dana Thomas's book Fashionopolis, shoppers in the West buy 5 times more items of clothing than they did in the 1980s, which is approximately 68 items per year. Obviously, however you acquire clothing, by making it yourself, shopping new or second-hand, or a combination of the above, it's a really wasteful and unsustainable situation that we've found ourselves in. And I don't know about you, but I don't have the time nor the desire to make 68 items per year for myself, let alone the other people in my family. So my conclusion with all these qualifiers is that it is possible to save money on clothing by sewing your own if you have a resource of fabric, you're using free patterns or ones you already own, you're making items that will have a long life, and at a rate that is much slower than the average quantity of garments bought by someone in the West. Remember the hashtag I mentioned in the intro a couple of episodes ago? The Great Winter Stitch Up? You might want to prioritise making warm layers for the foreseeable if you, like so many people, plan to keep the heating off as much as possible this winter. On the positive side, for most people listening to this podcast, sewing your own clothes is a far easier sell and often goes hand in hand with other benefits like relaxation. Okay, quilt making. Honestly, even suggesting this feels like we've gone back to Victorian pre-social welfare system times. But if you've got a quilt making project in the works, or it's something you've always fancied, now might be a good time to make that quilt. And of course, then actually use it for the purposes of keeping yourself warm, either in bed or when you're on the sofa or something. A full quilt making project is a real undertaking, so you might want to consider making a small lap quilt. That might be useful for those of you who work from home at the computer, or for those who are less mobile. And it needn't have much of a financial outlay if the top and bottom are made using scraps or fabric from your stash, or alternative sources of fabric such as unwanted bed linen. Could this be enjoyable? I guess the answer is entirely dependent on your interest in making a quilt, but there are so many different and incredibly creative interpretations as to what a quilt can look like that I'm sure some light research will unearth something inspiring for you. Next category, reusables. By reusables, I'm including washable sanitary products, reusable incontinent pads and pants, washable nappies, cleaning cloths, kitchen and tableware, bowl covers and handkerchiefs. To answer if making any of these items can really save us money, as well as preventing landfill, I've busted out my calculator. Strap in. Okay, so I decided to have a look into washable menstrual products. So, a period panty kit from Sew Project, which is a small business run by previous podcast guest Yelena Buck. One of those kits will cost you about £40. And this will make 2 to 3 pairs of pants depending on the size, plus from what I've found it will also include the gusset fabrics for at least 2 more pairs. My research has shown that shop-bought period pants are currently around £15 to £20 per pair, so making your own is slightly cheaper than buying reusable pants. You can also make these pants for even less if you just buy the gusset fabrics for about 3 pairs for £18 and use any jersey or undies elastic already in your stash. So, how does this add up? The cost of disposable menstrual pads really does vary, but they're approximately between 15 and 20 pence each. So, if a homemade pair of period pants costs about £13 in materials, and you compare each day of wearing a pair of period pants to wearing 4 disposable pads in a day, costing 15p each, you'll start saving money after 22 days of using that pair of pants. I then compared washable period pants to the more expensive organic cotton tampons that I buy. And in that case, I only need to wear my pair of period pants for 12 days before I start saving money. So if you can afford to invest in the kit and use each pair of pants twice per period, you'll start saving money in 6 months to a year's worth of periods. However, if you make yourself some washable pads rather than pants, you can start saving much quicker. There are heaps of free menstrual pad and panty liner templates available. I've had great success with cloth menstrual pads pattern by Luna Wolf. Link will be in the show notes. They have a buy me a cup of tea donation button on their page, so please donate if you can. I made a bunch of these using jersey and PUL, quilt and cotton, brush cotton and snaps that I already had in my stash. Granted, they would probably function a bit better if I had some of the absorbent gusset lining like the stuff from Sew Projects, but they still have done a great job for coming up to 3 years now. So, if you donate £5 to Luna Wolf for the pattern and make 5 pads using materials already in your stash, that works out at £1 per pad. Then, if you wear your washable pads and change them as often as you change a disposable one, you'd only have to use each washable pad 7 times before it started saving you money. Anyway, you get the idea. You can do the maths to see if each product is worth your time and initial outlay. For cleaning cloths, face cloths and napkins, all those type of things can easily be made from items that you already own. I'm sure different people have different tactics and solutions for these type of reusable items, but here is what I do. Every 6 months or so, I cut out squares from a faded bath towel that I got on FreeCycle and I overlock around the edges. I use those cloths then to wipe down the kitchen surfaces. I sling one in the wash after a few days of use when I'm doing a hot wash. I've done the same with some old tea towels that are now my cleaning cloths. They're basically the same as the kitchen surface ones, but the different fabrics make them easily identifiable for the different tasks. I also have some old baby muslins that I've overlocked around the edges that are really soft, so they're great for cleaning my kids' face and hands instead of disposable wet wipes. Bowl covers can replace foil or cling film. I haven't made them yet, but I intend to this month. So, is it fun making reusable items? Well, there are definitely kicks to be found from making these items, depending on what does it for you. If you need some motivation for making reusable menstrual products, definitely listen to the point Shams made in episode 49 about how the disposable menstrual product manufacturers have been extracting money from us every month since we were teenagers, and that should get you fired up enough to want to make some reusable ones. Okay, last category, volunteering. Right, so stay with me. Once again, I'm in no way suggesting that anyone use their sewing skills, knowledge, time, labour and resources in any way other than how you want to use them. But I've added this part to this episode to address a message from a listener that I recently received via Instagram. So, listener Amy says, just quoting part of her message here, I've been thinking about how I can support people in my community who may be struggling with a cost of living crisis and was wondering if you might be able to use your community to find out what people are doing across the UK and elsewhere and whether there are any campaigns listeners can contribute to. I'm mainly thinking about how I can use scraps and offcuts, thrifted fabric and my stash to make warmer clothes and accessories to also stick with sustainability in mind. Also aware that the best way to help people may not be free stuff, but actually through empowering people in a different way, but I'm not sure how, and sewing is my main skill. Okay, Amy and I then continue this conversation, but I want to put it to all of you, because I'm sure that Amy isn't the only one who has the desire to use her sewing for the benefit of others right now. And I'm sure that some of you know of organisations or campaigns that we can contribute to. My initial thoughts are contacting food banks, homeless shelters, women's refuge centres, centres for older people, or any organisation that you can find that supports low-income families. They would be best positioned to know what would be the most useful for their service users. If you're in the US or some other place that does this kind of thing, community food pantries might be a good focus for your energies, like Noah Hirsch from episode 45 does. So Noah stocks his local pantry with mended but otherwise good quality clothing that he finds discarded. If there's a specific person or group that is in charge of your local food pantry, you could ask them what they think might be needed that you could provide. I'm imagining that making a batch of washable menstrual pads could be really helpful for those that have access to washing facilities. Along a similar vein, the Days for Girls campaign is an international organisation distributing washable menstrual pads for those in need to limit the impact of period poverty. And the Pasha Mama project does a similar job by distributing pads to refugees. Both require volunteers to make the pads and then send them in to be distributed by the organisations. So if you know of any organisation or campaign that Amy or other interested listeners can support, please contact me via email at zoe@checkyourthread or via Instagram @checkyourthread. I'll collect the responses and share them in a future episode for all to hear. Right, that's all I've got currently on the topic of can sewing save you money. If you have any other ideas or are actively using your sewing skills to save you money in some way, please let me know via email or Instagram so I can share them in a follow-up. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!